Margaret never imagined her entire life would be reduced to ash in a matter of minutes. At 58, she wasn't wealthy. She wasn't famous. But she had something sacred, a small, creaky house on Sycamore Lane that smelled like lavender and old books. A house filled with memories, pain, laughter, and the ghosts of a past she clung to more tightly than she admitted. Her days followed a slow rhythm. Coffee at sunrise, gardening until her knees ached, a quiet lunch alone, and handwritten letters. She never sent letters to her late husband, to her estranged daughter, to herself. They were tucked away in drawers under floorboards, even hidden in the pages of books. Her home was her sanctuary and her story. Every floorboard, every photograph, every chipped teacup whispered fragments of her identity. Since her husband Peter died 10 years earlier, Margaret had built a life around silence. The house was too quiet, but it was hers. She had stopped expecting phone calls. She had stopped checking the mailbox for anything other than bills. Her daughter Lila hadn't visited in over 3 years, and though they exchanged occasional texts, there was always tension between the lines. Still, Margaret clung to her routines. She clipped recipes she never cooked. She planted flowers with names she couldn't pronounce. She watched the neighbor kids from her porch swing, smiling quietly when they ran barefoot across their yard. There was something tragically beautiful about the life she had. Unnoticed, unremarkable, but rooted. She told herself she didn't need more until the night of the fire. It began with a flicker, a faulty wire in the kitchen, a flash, a pop, and then smoke, thick and fast and choking. Margaret woke to the alarm, confused, coughing, stumbling barefoot across the floor. The house she'd spent a lifetime keeping safe now turned against her. She barely made it out. Flames roared through the living room as she clawed her way to the front door, eyes burning, lungs screaming. She collapsed on the lawn, coughing and shaking, staring in disbelief as her world ignited behind her. The neighbors called 911, sirens wailed in the distance. But by the time the fire trucks arrived, it was too late. Her life, photos, letters, Peter's coat still hanging on the hook, the garden journals, the curtains she made by hand, all of it gone. She sat wrapped in a blanket, watching the flames turn everything to black. A firefighter crouched beside her and asked if she was hurt. She shook her head. "I don't even know who I am without this," she whispered. He didn't know what to say, neither did she. In the days that followed, Margaret drifted through reality like a ghost. She was moved into a shelter provided by the local church, clean, quiet, but painfully unfamiliar. The mattress was too soft, the lights too bright, the food tasted like nothing. She missed the scent of lavender, the ticking of the old wall clock, the creak of the floor under her favorite armchair. She wore donated clothes that didn't fit, shoes that weren't hers. She avoided mirrors. Every morning she sat by the window, staring at the sidewalk. Her hands trembled when she sipped her coffee. She rarely spoke. When people tried to offer comfort, well-meaning volunteers, church members, she nodded politely, but her eyes said, "You don't understand," and they didn't. Her grief wasn't just about material loss. It was the erasure of identity. Her home had been a container for memory, emotion, legacy. Without it, she felt erased. On the third day, she asked about visiting the remains of her home. The pastor hesitated. "It's dangerous," he said gently, "and there's not much to see." But she insisted. He drove her in silence. When they arrived, the street looked different, smaller, grayer. The once colorful garden was reduced to black soil and twisted metal. The chimney stood like a gravestone in a field of soot. She walked through the rubble alone, careful not to cry, careful not to hope. She crouched near where the living room had been, brushed away a layer of ash and uncovered something, a fragment of porcelain, a piece of her favorite teacup. She held it in her palm like a sacred relic. The pastor didn't speak. He knew not to. That night, Margaret didn't sleep. She sat upright in the shelter bed, staring at the fragment on her nightstand. It was meaningless to anyone else, but to her it was proof she had existed. In the following days, her body was present, but her spirit was fading. She refused therapy. She didn't eat much, she barely moved. And then one afternoon, a volunteer named Elena, young, soft-spoken, with curious eyes, found a folder of charred paper tucked in Margaret's donated coat. Letters, some half burned, some still readable. Elena read one and cried. The next day, she returned to Margaret's room and said, "These are beautiful." Did you write them? Margaret stared at her. I read this one. The one about your husband's chair still being warm when he left. I've never read anything that made me feel so much. Margaret blinked, unsure how to respond. Elena sat beside her, quiet for a moment, then asked, would you ever let someone else read them too? Margaret didn't answer, but something in her eyes flickered. Elena didn't press her. She simply returned the next day with tea and a notebook. She placed them on the table and said, if ever you feel like writing again, I'll read every word. She left the notebook untouched for 2 days. But on the third night, when the shelter was quiet and the lights dimmed, Margaret opened it. Her hands shook. Her mind raced. She wrote a single sentence. Today, I remembered the way Peter used to hum when he made eggs. She closed the notebook and cried. The next morning, Elena found the page. She didn't speak. She smiled, left a pencil beside the notebook, and walked away. Each night after that, Margaret wrote a little more. Not long letters, just thoughts, images, feelings, regrets. She wrote about her first kiss, about the smell of sawdust in Peter's shed, about the arguments she had with Lila when she refused to sell the house, about the time she caught her reflection in the window and didn't recognize herself. Writing didn't fix anything, but it reminded her she was still here. After a week, Elena approached her again. There's a community newspaper that sometimes shares personal stories. Would you ever consider letting them publish one of your letters? Margaret's instinct was to say no, but instead she asked, would my name be attached? Elena smiled. Only if you wanted to. She thought about it for a long time. That night she rewrote one of the letters more carefully. It was about a dream she had 2 days after the fire, where she walked through her old house and found Peter waiting at the kitchen table. The next week, that letter appeared on page 6 of the local paper, signed only as M. Margaret didn't expect much. But something strange happened. The shelter's phone rang. People left voicemails asking who M was. A woman dropped off flowers and a card. A man came by just to say thank you. One message stood out. It was from an older man named Roy. He said, I don't know who M is, but her words made me cry in a diner this morning. I haven't cried in 20 years. Whoever she is, tell her she reminded me I still feel things. Margaret listened to that message 3 times, and for the first time since the fire, she smiled. Not because things were better, but because maybe, just maybe, she hadn't burned with the house. Maybe something had survived. Margaret sat by the shelter window, notebook in hand, watching the rain trace lines down the glass. For the first time in weeks, her pen moved without fear. She wasn't writing for Peter anymore. She wasn't writing for the past. She was writing for someone out there, someone like Roy, someone who might be sitting alone thinking it's too late to feel anything again. Elena approached her that afternoon. The paper asked if they could publish more of your letters. They said people are asking for them by name. Margaret laughed softly. By name? I didn't even give them one. They're calling you the woman with the ashes in her heart, Elena grinned. That night, Margaret stayed up writing, page after page, her hand steady. She wasn't trying to be wise or poetic. She was just telling the truth about pain, about memory, about fire, and how it doesn't just destroy, it reveals. She ended one letter with a line that would stay with her. Maybe what survives the fire isn't the body, but the voice. The shelter lights buzzed overhead. Outside, the city slept, but inside, Margaret was beginning to wake up. From ash, something was rising, and for the first time, it had a name, her own. News of M continued to ripple through the small city like a quiet storm. No one knew exactly who she was, but her words had begun to show up everywhere, on bulletin boards, tucked inside library books, even scribbled in chalk on sidewalks. One letter in particular seemed to strike a universal chord. I thought losing everything meant I had nothing left to give. I was wrong. Sometimes the ashes make the soil richer. Margaret read that line over and over again, stunned that she had written it. Elena brought her copies of the letters people were sending in response. There were dozens now. A widower who had stopped speaking after his wife passed sent a note saying, I read her letter and talk to my daughter for the first time in 3 years. A woman in her 70s wrote, I've lived in silence for decades. It made me want to tell my story. Something was happening, something Margaret hadn't planned or even believed was possible. She had become a voice for people who had forgotten their own. The shelter staff offered her a small desk in the corner of the communal room. There, she began to respond to the letters, sometimes with handwritten notes, sometimes just with a quote or memory. She didn't offer advice, she offered recognition. And for many, that was enough. But the attention brought new challenges too. One afternoon, the local news station arrived at the shelter. A journalist, mid-30s, bright-eyed, with a camera crew behind her, asked to interview M. Elena approached Margaret gently and explained the request. "They want to meet you on camera." Margaret froze. Her instinct was to hide, to vanish. "I'm not some hero," she said quietly. "I'm just recovering." Elena smiled. "Exactly. That's why they need to hear you." After a long pause, Margaret agreed, under one condition: no makeup, no scripting. "I speak as I am." The segment aired 2 nights later. The footage was simple. Margaret sitting in a modest chair, her hands folded, eyes clear but tired. She talked about Peter, about the fire, about the silence after. She read part of the letter about the eggs and the humming, and when asked why, she replied, "Because I thought I was gone. But when I wrote, I found myself again." The video went viral, not just in her town, but across the country. Margaret had never heard the word viral used that way before. She didn't have a smartphone, she barely used email. But Elena explained what was happening. "You're everywhere," she said, placing a tablet in front of her. "Look, videos of people reading her letters aloud, podcasts discussing her, story." A high school English teacher had his students write letters to their future selves after reading Margaret's excerpts. One video showed a group of elderly residents at a nursing home taking turns reading Margaret's letter about grief, each of them adding their own memories in between the lines. It wasn't just healing for them, it was a reunion of emotions long buried. Margaret watched, stunned. She wasn't sure how to feel. "How are strangers crying over my life?" she whispered. Elena smiled. "Because it's their life too." With every passing day, more letters arrived. Some were from people who had lost spouses, parents, children. Others came from those who were still in the fire, still burning, still trying to escape. Each one a tiny lifeline tossed into the void, hoping someone like M would pull it closer. And Margaret did, but not alone. She asked Elena if others in the shelter might want to write too. The staff cleared a small room, placed a long table inside, and stocked it with paper, pens, and folders. Margaret called it the Ashes Circle. At first, only 3 people came. A soft-spoken man named Jerome who never made eye contact, a young woman named Naomi who wore headphones all the time, and Mrs. Delacroix, an 81-year-old who claimed she only came for the free cookies. But over time, the room filled. People shared their stories aloud. Some cried, some just sat quietly and listened. Margaret facilitated without leading. She simply opened the space, and the words followed. One night, Jerome spoke for the first time. His voice cracked when he read a piece about watching his dog run back into the burning house. "I never told anyone that," he said, wiping tears. Margaret nodded. "Now you have?" She realized something profound. Her healing wasn't about being heard. It was about helping others speak. And through that, she found a deeper purpose than she had ever known. The Ashes Circle soon became more than just a writing group. It was a sanctuary, a place where broken people could lay their pieces down without judgment. Word spread, and people from outside the shelter began asking if they could join. A retired librarian who had lost her partner to cancer, a man who survived a car crash that killed his best friend, a teenager who hadn't spoken in public since being bullied years ago. They all came, and they all wrote. Margaret never imagined she would lead anything, let alone a movement. But as the weeks passed, she found herself speaking in front of groups, helping others shape their words, encouraging them to dig deeper. She didn't have degrees or credentials, just experience, pain, and a voice that had once been silent, now echoing with purpose. One evening as the group wrapped up, Elena pulled Margaret aside. "There's someone here to see you, Margaret." I turned and froze. It was Lila, her daughter. She stood near the entrance, arms crossed, unsure whether to step forward or run away. Her eyes were red but dry, her posture stiff but fragile. Margaret took a step forward. "I saw the video," Lila said. "Someone from work sent it to me." Margaret's heart raced. "I didn't think you'd care," she replied softly. "I didn't," Lila said, almost harshly. At least not at first. I thought it was another way for you to avoid talking to me directly." There was silence. Then Lila added, "But then I read the letter about the humming. The one about Dad." I read it out loud, and I cried. Margaret nodded. Me too. They didn't hug. Not yet. But Lila stayed. She sat in the back of the next Ashes circle. She didn't speak. She didn't write. But she listened. Margaret saw her eyes well up when Jerome read another piece. And when Naomi handed Lila a cookie with a smile, she smiled back. It wasn't reconciliation. Not yet, but it was something. Beginning. Later that night, after everyone had left the common room, Margaret found herself alone with Lila. The lights were dim, the chairs still slightly warm from where people had sat moments earlier. Lila broke the silence. You wrote so many letters. Why didn't you ever send one to me?" Margaret looked down at her hands. "I did," she whispered. "Dozens. I just never had the courage to put them in the mailbox." Lila's voice cracked. "Why?" "I was afraid they'd come back unopened, or worse, ignored." For a moment, they sat in that fragile honesty. Then Lila said, "I want to read them, if you still have them." Margaret smiled softly. "I don't have the originals, but I remember the words." Lila nodded. "Then tell me, one by one." And so, over tea made in the shared shelter kitchen, Margaret began to speak the letters she had never sent. Some were simple, some were angry, most were filled with regret and longing. Lila listened to every word, and by the time the sun peeked over the horizon, they were both crying. Not out of pain, but because the silence between them was finally breaking. The next week, the Ashes Circle hosted a community night open to the public. Flyers were posted at libraries and coffee shops. Words from the ashes, a night of shared. Letters, the room overflowed. People brought their own stories. Some read aloud. Others handed letters to be read by volunteers. The air was thick with emotion, vulnerability, and something else, hope. Margaret watched from the front row as Lila took the microphone. She unfolded a crumpled page and began to read. It wasn't one of Margaret's letters, it was her own. "To the woman I once blamed for my silence, thank you for showing me how to speak." Margaret wept openly, because in that moment she knew the fire hadn't just taken things from her. It had cleared the way for something new to grow, something unbroken, something that would last. The morning after the event, Margaret woke up with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. Her joints still ached, her memories still flickered between joy and sorrow, but something had shifted. Was no longer surviving, she was building. That same day, Elena arrived at the shelter with news. "Our publishing house reached out," she said, eyes gleaming. "They read your letters, they want to publish them." Margaret blinked. "A book? Of my letters?" Elena nodded. "They want to call it Letters from the Ashes." The thought of her private moments, her raw confessions, bound and sold like paperbacks in airport bookstores, made Margaret recoil at first. But then she thought of the people who had written to her, the ones who said her words had cracked something open, the ones who had written for the first time in decades, the ones who had finally spoken the names of their dead without shame. "Only if the others are included too," she said firmly. "Not just me." Elena smiled. They agreed. Every piece from the Ashes Circle will be in it, with permission. A few weeks later, Margaret held the first printed copy in her hands. It wasn't glossy or grand. The cover was soft, the title embossed in faint gold. But when she opened it and saw the words printed on that first page, words she had once written through tears, she felt something bloom in her chest. She hadn't just survived the fire, she had turned it into something that would outlast her. The launch event was modest. A local bookstore offered space, and folding chairs were brought in to accommodate the crowd. People came from towns she had never heard of. Some brought gifts, others just came to listen. At the front of the room, a small sign read, "Sometimes it takes a fire to find your voice." Margaret looked out at the crowd. Her hands didn't tremble. She was ready to speak. Margaret stepped up to the small podium. She wore a navy blue dress borrowed from one of the shelter volunteers. Simple pearl. Earrings, no makeup, no prepared speech, just a folded page. She cleared her throat and smiled at the audience. Strangers, friends, fellow writers from the Ashes Circle, and even members of the shelter staff who had once handed her donated slippers in silence. Then she began to read. "This letter was never meant to be shared," she said. "I wrote it to myself." On the third night after the fire, she opened the page. "You are not done. The house is gone, but you are not. You still breathe. You still cry. You still remember. That means there's something left to build from. It won't be the same. It never is. But maybe it can be something new, something softer, something honest. When she finished, there was no applause at first, only silence, then a single clap, then another. Then the whole room stood. Tears, nods, hands over hearts. Margaret sat back down, her body trembling now, but not from fear. From release. She looked at Lila seated 2 rows from the front. Her daughter's eyes shimmered with pride. After the reading, she hugged Margaret tightly and whispered, "That was the first time I ever saw you." It broke something inside her and healed it at the same time. Over the next few days, messages poured in. Not just from readers, but from media outlets, universities, grief counselors, and even survivors of natural disasters. Everyone wanted to talk to Margaret, but she said no to most. She wasn't interested in interviews or television deals. She didn't want to be famous. She wanted to keep writing. She wanted to keep listening. She wanted to keep making space for voices that had been silenced by loss, shame, or time, because she knew what it was like to be voiceless. And now that she had hers back, she planned to use it well. In the months that followed, the Ashes Circle grew into something none of them had expected. What had started as a quiet writing group in a shelter was now being replicated in other cities. Inspired by Margaret's story, churches, libraries, and community centers launched their own versions, circles where people could gather, write, and share without fear. Margaret was invited to speak at one in a nearby town. She was hesitant, but Elena insisted, "You don't have to perform, just show up. Be you." So she went. The circle was held in the basement of an old church. The chairs were metal and cold, the lighting dim, but the stories that filled the room warmed the air. A man who hadn't spoken in public since returning from war read a letter to his younger self. A woman who lost her child shared a piece about naming trees after memories. Margaret didn't speak that night. She didn't need to. Just her presence told him it was okay to feel broken and brave at the same time. On the drive back, Elena asked her how she felt. "Like I'm part of something bigger than myself," Margaret said. "Like I'm finally useful." Elena laughed. "You've always been useful. You just forgot." Back at the shelter, life remained simple. Margaret still took her tea by the window each morning. She still wore the same wool cardigan she had been given the week of the fire, but something in her had undeniably changed. People began referring to her not just as M, but as the letter woman. And with each letter she received, each confession, each moment of courage penned by trembling hands, Margaret replied with something more than words. She replied with presence, with patience, with the sacred promise, "I hear you," because being heard had saved her. And now she passed that gift on to others. One crisp October morning, Margaret received a letter unlike any other. It came in a lavender envelope with no return address. Inside, there was only a single page. Handwritten in neat cursive, "I was the firefighter who pulled you from the lawn that night. I never forgot what you whispered. I don't even know who I am without this." I've thought about that sentence every day. I've seen a lot of fires, a lot of loss, but I've never seen someone rise from it the way you have. Thank you for proving that some things can't be burned away. She read it 3 times before folding it carefully and tucking it inside the first copy of her book. That afternoon, she stood in front of the Ashes Circle and read it aloud. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her, every breath held. Jerome wiped his eyes. Naomi reached for another tissue. Mrs. Delacroix muttered something about too many feelings and handed out cookies again. Margaret smiled. "I used to think survival was the end goal," she told him. "But now I think it's just the beginning. Survival gives us the chance to witness, and witnessing gives us the chance to connect." After the session, a young woman who had only attended twice approached her. "I haven't spoken to my father in 7 years," she said. "But after hearing you today, I think I want to write to him." Margaret placed a hand on hers. "Start with one sentence, that's all it takes." She watched the girl walk away and realized something simple but profound. Not everyone needs to rebuild a house. Sometimes all they need is a place to put their story and someone to say, "It matters." Margaret had become that someone, and she wasn't finished yet. That evening, Margaret returned to her room, lit softly by the golden hue of sunset. On her desk sat a stack of envelopes, new letters, new stories, new voices waiting to be heard. She opened one at random. It was from a man named Daniel, age 72. The letter was short but heavy. I lost my wife 2 years ago. I haven't spoken to anyone about it, but your letters, they made me feel like it was okay to cry again. Margaret exhaled slowly and picked up her pen. She didn't craft anything elaborate, just a line of truth. Grief is not a weakness. It's proof that we've loved deeply. She sealed the envelope and smiled. Her fingers were slower these days, but her heart moved faster than ever. Later, she sat by the window, holding a warm mug of chamomile tea. Outside, the wind stirred leaves along the sidewalk, dancing in circles before settling. She thought of the fire, the smell of smoke, the sound of loss. And then she thought of Lila, of Elena, of Jerome, Naomi, Mrs. Delacroix, and all the others whose names filled her journals. She no longer feared the silence. She no longer mourned the house because she had built something else. A legacy made not of bricks but of words. And for the first time in a very long time, Margaret felt whole, not despite the fire, but because of it. Months passed, and winter arrived quietly. The air turned sharp, and frost kissed the edges of the windows at the shelter. But inside, warmth radiated from the lives Margaret had touched. The Ashes Circle was now a network, connected by letters, emails, and monthly readings held across the country. People who once felt invisible were now seen, heard, and embraced, all because one woman chose to put pen to paper after her world had burned down. Margaret still wrote every day. Some letters were replies, others were memories she hadn't yet released. Many were simply words of hope that she folded into envelopes and mailed anonymously. But one morning she began writing something different, her own story, not in fragments, not in letters, but as a complete, cohesive journey, a book. Elena helped organize her thoughts, and together they structured a memoir that wove her pain with her resilience. They titled it Unbroken, a life written in ashes. Publishers fought. As for the rights, documentary crews asked to follow her. One of her old high school classmates emailed her after seeing a feature about her in a national magazine. "You always had that quiet strength," he wrote. "Now the world finally sees it too." Margaret didn't respond with excitement or pride. She simply replied, "Thank you. I hope my story helps someone find theirs." And that's exactly what it did. One snowy afternoon, Margaret visited the spot where her house once stood. It had been over a year. The lot had been cleared and the city had turned it into a quiet, community garden. Rows of fresh soil lined the space. Young trees stretched toward the sky. A wooden bench stood at the center with a small plaque attached. It read, "In memory of all things lost, in celebration of all things found." Margaret sat there for a long while. She touched the plaque with careful fingers. She closed her eyes and breathed in the cold air. It no longer smelled like smoke. It smelled like life. A little boy ran past. Her, laughing. A man with headphones watered the roots. A mother handed her toddler a tiny shovel. It was no longer a grave. It was a beginning. That evening, she wrote a new letter. One final letter. Not to Peter, not to herself, but to you. If you're reading this and you feel like everything is gone, if you feel like the fire, whatever your fire is, has taken all that you are, I want you to remember something. Simple. You are still here, and that means you are still becoming. The ashes don't define you. They fertilize the ground beneath your next chapter. So please write it, even if your hand shakes, even if your voice trembles. Write it anyway. The world needs to hear it, and I'll be listening. She folded the letter and placed it on her windowsill. Not to be mailed, but to be remembered. Spring came early that year. The flowers bloomed with urgency, as if they too had been waiting to rise from the cold. Margaret moved out of the shelter into a small cottage gifted to her by a non-profit organization that had followed her story. It was modest, 2 rooms, a kitchenette, and a porch with chipped paint, but it was hers. She filled it with secondhand books, donated furniture, and handwritten letters from strangers who had become friends. Lila visited every weekend. They didn't talk about the fire anymore. They talked about the future. One Sunday morning, as they sipped tea on the porch, Lila asked, "Do you ever miss the old house?" Margaret thought for a moment. I miss the sounds, the smells, the memories, yes, but not the walls." Lila nodded. You built something stronger. That afternoon, they hosted a small gathering in a garden near the shelter. Survivors, writers, friends. They read letters, laughed, cried. Jerome played guitar. Naomi baked cookies. Mrs. Delacroix brought tissues and complained about the heat. And when it was time for Margaret to speak, she said only this: "We all burn. We all lose. But if you're lucky, the fire leaves behind the pieces you really needed, the ones you never knew you had." The crowd was silent. Then someone in the back shouted, "Read it again." She did. And this time, they said it with her. Together. That night, Margaret sat under the stars, pen in hand, writing one last entry in her journal. She didn't write about the fire. She didn't write about the house. She wrote about voices, quiet, shaky, rising. She wrote about you, about anyone out there who feels forgotten, erased, or too far gone. You are not the silence left after the storm, she wrote. You are the song that comes after it. And now, if you've made it this far, maybe you're holding something too, a memory, a loss, a beginning you haven't dared to start. Don't keep it inside. Write your letter. Tell your story. Even if no one reads it yet, start anyway, because your voice matters and you're not alone. If Margaret's story touched something inside you, consider subscribing to Unbroken Stories. Here, every week, we share true stories of resilience, redemption, and quiet miracles. Stories that remind us it's never too late to start again. Subscribe now and join this circle of voices, because maybe your story is the next one we'll tell. Weeks later, a package arrived at Margaret's cottage. Inside was a scrapbook, dozens of pages filled with photographs, printed emails, and handwritten letters, all from people whose lives had been touched by her words. Some were children writing about their grandparents. Others were war veterans, widows, or people recovering from addiction. At the end of the scrapbook, a note was tucked into the back cover. "You didn't just survive your fire. You became a lighthouse for the rest of us." Margaret held it to her chest. She didn't cry. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Then she placed the book on a shelf beside the worn notebook where it all began. Outside, wind danced through the garden. Birds chirped with early spring energy. The cottage, though humble, glowed with something sacred. And inside, a woman once thought forgotten kept writing, kept listening, kept showing the world what it meant to be unbroken. And now, it's your turn. Because no matter what you've been through, no matter what you've lost, if she found her voice through fire, you can find yours too. So don't wait for permission. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Start with what you have right now, because healing begins with a single word.